Well, after that great session, it's time for our next exciting session. I would like to invite and introduce Mr. Arvind Shivaramakrishnan, Chief Information Officer, who's going to be the chair and moderator for this session from Apollo Hospitals. I would please request him on the stage.
Namaste. Thank you, Vibhor. I'll take it from here. Wonderful topic examining National Digital Health Mission, data sharing, privacy, and security considerations. And joining me today in deliberating these aspects of data sharing, privacy, and security are three very eminent and very good friends of mine, very knowledgeable in the subject, and I'm happy to introduce them to you. May I call on stage Mr. Kumar KV. Kumar is the CIO at Narayana Health, a very senior information technology and security leader. He specializes in digital strategy, digital innovation, systems design, and it's a unique blend of architect who brings in the perspective of healthcare processes along with security, privacy, and makes it the best experience for the customers that they serve. Thank you, Kumar, for being with us today.
Thanks, Arvind. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I next invite on stage Dr. Bharat Saraf. Dr. Saraf is a director with PhonePe and is heading their privacy and compliance program. He holds a PhD in law, specializing in e-commerce, data privacy, and cybersecurity from Monash University, Australia. Dr. Bharat is also holds the prestigious DSCI Privacy Leaders certification on DCPLA on data, and he'll bring in a perspective from the financial sector and working with the healthcare sector, what we can learn and how we can make that happen in the healthcare sector. Thank you, Dr. Bharat, for joining us.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Arvind, for the introduction. Pleasure.
Last but definitely not the least, may I invite on stage Mr. Arun Prabhu. Arun is a partner at the Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas law firm, and he is a specialist and advises extensively on matters relating to data protection and privacy, including issues surrounding data collection, processing, protection, and retention of data. Thank you, Arun, for joining us today. So we have a provider, we have a member from the financial sector working very closely on disrupting and helping digital transformation in the healthcare sector. And we have a legal expert. And so what we will start with is, Kumar, I'll start with you in terms of from your perspective of what you're seeing in the healthcare sector, the provider's view of it. What are you doing for effective data sharing, keeping in mind the construct of the proposed PDP bill on both the aspects of privacy and security?
Yeah, thanks, Arvind. See, from a provider standpoint, we took an action, I would say, say at least a couple of quarters back, or I would say 6 months back, where the first thing that we did was to execute a privacy impact assessment. What a privacy impact assessment basically means is to, you have to understand what is your current state of maturity, or what is your current state of data management, and understand what is the desired state, based on a prevailing law. In our case, even though the India PDP law has not even come into force, we still have to comply with, the privacy aspects of the IT Amendment Act. Apart from this, since we operate an international hospital, we have to comply to the law of the land. There is a privacy law which is there in Cayman Islands, so which we need to comply for that. So we took our Cayman Islands hospital as a model and executed a privacy impact based on the DSCI privacy framework. So we had consultants basically coming in and doing this. The DSCI privacy framework basically has all the best in breed of the principles, the controls that is actually, that is followed in other countries like Australia, Canada, US, Singapore, and also from India. So they've taken all these and distilled everything and, given this in a neat framework. And this framework when we executed the assessment, we said that we segregated into three classes: one which is mandated by law, two which is required to implement. It's not mandatory, but if you implement it, it is good from a DPL aspect. Third is basically required to implement as per the privacy framework. So when you have a clear vision, so what is mandated by law, invariably you have to implement that. And the second was more of best practices. Third was more of optional thing, but if you do it, it is always good, right? And in this DPS framework, we had multiple areas. There are 9 different areas of the DPF where you have visibility over private information. So it talks about your entire data, how you create your information, how you process your information, how you store your information, how do you archive or purge your information, right? So an entire life cycle is actually mapped, and we understand how the data basically flows, how data is fed into systems of records to systems of engagement, right? And what is the structure required to execute this initiative? What are the various supplier relations that you have? How your contracts need to be architected? Now, considering that data becomes the central part of every contract, what are some of the controls that we need to put in to protect our organizations? What are the regulatory compliance adherence that we need to follow? Awareness is a key. What should be the type of awareness that we should actually provide to our stakeholders? More importantly, for all the technology systems which are customer facing, we executed a privacy testing to understand what is our state from a privacy standpoint. It is very important to understand that knowingly or unknowingly, there are certain, when we outsource certain work or when we buy certain applications, there are trackers that are actually embedded, which might actually go against the mandated law or the control that is actually there. So there are a multitude of areas that need to be discovered, and we didn't do all that in a week's time. We took at least 6 months time to do a detailed assessment and come up with an overarching design. But there are certain things which we can demonstrate it as quick wins, something like data sharing agreements, changing all the supplier contracts to ensure that in a very systematic manner, right? And then building out the entire data lifecycle map, right? So those are some of the things which we are able to, and improving the readability score of our privacy policy, not making it hazy, so that customers, when they read it, they'll be able to make a very informed choice, right? So those are some of the actions that we did as an organization. There is a good amount of work to be done in this space in the coming years. Thanks.
Kumar, three takeaways. One, data becoming the central of almost everything that we do, and how we really need to take a step back and relook at how we are currently practicing. The second aspect that you mentioned was do a privacy testing and make sure you actually know what you're doing. Because a lot of stuff I'm thinking you're politely telling all of us that you really don't know what you're doing, and things are going really bad. And the third aspect is also very important, Kumar, what you mentioned, readability, so that people really understand and actually take to heart uh, everything related to privacy and doesn't just sound like a long verbose. And I shouldn't say that when with two of my legal friends with me, but writing something in legalese and not expecting people to understand and say, I agree in the end. Readability, I think, brings in a lot of accountability and some sort of being responsible about how you communicate that. Perfect, perfect. Great points, Kumar. Thank you for that. I'll move next to Dr. Bharat. Dr. Bharat, you are working with PhonePe, and the way the financial sector is working with various sectors, healthcare to in specific now, on disrupting the standard processes, at the same time trying to make it consumer friendly. Uh, and the financial sector obviously is leading in all of this. The amount of work that you've done with the e-commerce sector, all that must be tremendous amount of things. But somewhere we feel that the healthcare sector is slow to this party. So, very straight question: how much do we providers really frustrate you? And what is it that we should be doing so that we are, one, being responsible, second, we are catching up with pace. Healthcare is a very regimented sector, so a little bit of transformation there happens, at a slower pace, arguably for right reasons also. Uh, but from the way you are looking at it, from the outside in perspective, tell us what can we learn and how we can do things better.
Sure. Thanks, Arvind. Clearly, as I see the health sector at the moment seems to be at the same juncture where financial services digitization was a few years back. And if you really ask me, I think the pertinent question whether it really frustrates one from outside, I think this was a similar question that would have been relevant a few years back for the financial services sector as well. Because consumers waiting at banks, getting their finances sorted, maybe getting a passbook updated, all used to create a sort of hurdles for the financial sector as a whole. And what we are witnessing today with especially NDHM is something similar, as I said, because at the moment, if you look at how the health services is organized, I think it is a lot fragmented. There is a lot of, if I may say, consumer hurdles that the consumer faces, right? Right from, I mean, going to hospitals, booking appointments, having particular treatments from doctors, running from pillar to post to collect different reports. Considering all of these particular hurdles, plus also taking into account the current regulatory regime that is available, where the health sector can actually utilize data to better digitize the services. I think what we see as part of the NDHM is really we are at the cusp of a revolution. Because we can see that data is going to be digitalized, centralized, and used for the benefit of the consumer. So there are a lot of lessons to be learned in this area, not only from the financial services sector, but if you look at the global markets. Denmark, for example, South Korea, Australia have all gone through the same health services digitization project, and have so far been successful in centralizing all the particular data of the patients, cross utilizing the data, having that interoperability which is required for better provision of services to the consumer. I think there are these good lessons also from global markets perspective. And what better lesson than the recent pandemic, right? Because everybody witnessed so many hurdles, so many frustrations around data of patients across the globe. And specifically, if you look at India, I think because of the lack of digitization and centralization of data, I think clearly the clinical trials, the research on medicines could have been better if we would have had this particular mission that we are talking about already been implemented. So there is what I would say is there's clear learnings both from the financial sector, from global markets, plus the current pandemic, which throws a lot of light on the advantages of having digital records of patients, utilizing that data, making it interoperable, and providing services to benefit the customer. Having said that, I think what is also important to a health sector, especially from a regulatory regime perspective, is also something similar to what happened with the financial services industry a few years back. Because the type of data that health sector deals with is sensitive personal data. And that needs a particular regulatory regime that requires particular industry based standards, and that requires a lot of cooperation among both central, state, public authorities, as well as the private sector. So if you look at how the financial services has come about, I think the NDHM is following a similar approach, where there is going to be um, uh, a centralized vault holding all the data of the particular consumers, and the HIPs and HIUs are going to utilize that particular vault basis consumer consent to utilize that particular data and leverage the interoperability. So clearly, I think there is learnings to be had from the financial sector. But as I see in the past 1 year, also with the sandbox as to how the NDHM has come about, I think it's on the right track, and a few improvements and modifications basis the pilot will surely take the NDHM and the mission around the health sector a long way. And for sure, we can look forward to a revolution in this particular sector.
Perfect, Dr. Bharat. Better services once we digitalize, data being centralized, and the learnings from the financial sector, and how to go about the regulations so that there is a good, tag teaming between the state and the federal rules, and the practices that will evolve as the sector goes, with health being a state subject. So thank you for those views. Arun, I come next to you. Uh, you're coming in from a legal perspective here, and we do a lot of, and like what Dr. Bharat said, everything that we deal with in the healthcare sector, every bit of data, uh, in fact, even the timestamp in the record is going to be sensitive personal information. So there's not much in our database in healthcare that's not part of the sensitive personal information. And there's so much that we can do with data. So let's look at the economy. Let's not sidestep monetization, the power of data, the economy that can happen with it, what right things can happen in terms of care pathways and algorithms for care practices. And many a times we get very enthusiastic about it and go about doing things, not always right. Uh, I will give the benefit of doubt that it was started with the right intention, but as the way the law looks at it, not the right way. So, your perspectives on how we need to learn to look at it from the law's perspective, uh, a brief in terms of how we see it today and how we need to see it tomorrow. Of course, fully acknowledging that the bills are still in Parliament, not yet notified as law, but in good faith, if we take that forward, how do we need to see these two so that we are doing it right? And these laws, as what Bharat and Kumar were alluding to, are not going to become a hurdle for the industry and the economy to grow.
Thank you, sir. Um, I'll take from what my co-speakers sort of said and add to it. Uh, Unlike the financial sector, where there's been a very active, hands-on kind of regulator setting down a whole bunch of basic principles, standards, there's been a history of audit. There's been a history of notices going out to people if their systems aren't up to scratch. Or, for instance, the ITS sector, where the load of sensitive information or personal information is a lot lower. The healthcare sector is in a very unique place. A lot of the law around privacy, incidentally, has been written in the context of healthcare information. So, to give you an example, Mr. X versus Hospital Z, one of the first cases where the Supreme Court actually had to balance the fine balance between the right to individual privacy and the right to individual life. This was obviously a case where the HIV positive status of a person was in question, and the Supreme Court had to decide whether their partner had a right to know because their lives would potentially be in danger. That's a balance we're still trying to find today. And as we've seen from the report of the Personal Data Protection Committee and the bill that's been revised and put out, that's a balance we still struggle to find at times. I think a principle-based approach is most important in this sector more than perhaps anywhere else, because One, the data is just so incredibly personal and so incredibly valuable. Number two, the temptation to use it beyond the ambit of its collection is very high. It's often and three, the justifications are so easily within reach. If I am to summarize the requirement of the new PDP bill in a sentence, and a short sentence at that, it is that data be collected, stored, and processed fairly and reasonably in view of the purposes of its collection, fundamentally. Now, this is obviously a 100,000 square foot, 100,000 foot overview of it. But I think it's useful in answering your question. If I am a hospital or a caregiver who is collecting data for the purposes of an individual incident of patient care or patient treatment, say a surgery or something equally familiar, then the four corners of that collection, storage, and processing are very clear. I collect the information, I use it for that process, and at the end of it, that's that. I can potentially stretch it a little bit and say, look, if I have to come in for post operative care, or I have to look at your treatment subsequently, I have to look at your regimen, this data is still of relevance. I will sort of hold on to it, but I will hold it in trust for you. Where this becomes much more tricky, for instance, is the improvement of care to everyone. Now, we all know that in the world of AI, the inclusion of larger and larger data sets, especially epidemiological data sets, radiation dosimetry data sets, imaging data sets, can create a visible and tangible improvement in the quality of care that is to be provided to patients. Whether that is detection of artifacts in images which human eyes cannot detect, or it is a case of predicting the outcome of a pandemic, or predicting where the caseloads are going to go up so that, say, oxygen concentrators can be put in the right locations. These are all tangible cases where the usage of data beyond the original purpose for which it was collected can provide life-saving consequences. Now, the tricky part, of course, is that these life-saving consequences can also be very financially remunerative to everybody, as life-saving consequences tend to be. If I can say that, look, my AI engine can detect cancer 20% faster than the next guy, it is literally worth its weight in gold, or much more. I will pay that much more for that ability to avail of that technology. The second order of this, of course, is that this is useful not for the person whose data. So my imagery coming in and my negative imagery going into something is not going to benefit me in any way. It will benefit potentially the healthcare system in general, because your care for that particular demographic or that cohort will go up, but it will not affect me directly. So the ability to correlate the purpose of collection or the purpose of processing with the individual's benefit is one step further. Now let's take it two steps further. If I am part of a healthcare insurance system where the interest is that the right level of care be given to everybody, premiums be managed, especially in a group insurance policy, that doctors be allowed to, doctors only have natural safeguards against overprescription or over treatment, and basically some good rules of the road are put in place. Uh, um, Obviously, that has tangible benefits to the ecosystem as a whole in terms of improving profitability. But there is also the interesting side benefit that it also improves insurer profitability, that it reduces underwriting risk, and so on and so forth. The usage of healthcare data to justify that becomes even more problematic. So a simple motherhood statement saying fair, reasonable processing in the interests of the data subject is very difficult to wrap around these second order issues. The way this has been dealt with, of course, is to have principles like proportionality, principles like benefit, greater good, and so on and so forth. And second, to have subject matter specific and sector specific rules which are put out by a fair, transparent regulator. If we look at the experience of the GDPR, for instance, and Dr. Bharat will probably chime in as well, the regulator there has followed a very interesting approach. Even before the GDPR was enacted, there were thousands of reams of guidance which are put out by the Article 29 Working Party around all these small things. What can it be used for? Can I use it for spam filtering? Can I use it for this? Can I use it for that? Is that in line with the principle? Is it not in line with the principle? Second, even after the GDPR kicked in, it's not as if fines started being handed out the next day. There was again extensive guidance which was put out by the various information commissioners. Lastly, only when people insisted on following a policy that was fundamentally not in line with the principles were fines handed out. One hopes and prays that our Data Protection Authority, which to my mind, and Mr. Shroff said this too on a conference recently, yeah, is probably going to be one of the most powerful regulators in the country. One hopes that this authority will follow a similar approach and will follow an approach that is compatible with the principles which have been put in the NDHM, which have been put in the EHR guidelines, which have been put by the Medical Council of India, where sector regulators are taken under the tent in terms of describing the rules that will govern an entire sector. One hopes that will be the case, but it remains to be seen.
Arun, nicely alluded into the tricky areas of data, and as you were talking, I was also looking at some of the questions coming up in the chat in terms of whether data has there been instances of data being misused, and can data be misused? And I completely agree with you in terms of while your example on let's say somebody detects saying they can have 20% efficacy in detecting cancer, you're absolutely right. Absolutely fantastic thing. Everybody will stand behind it. But then you're also right, when you come to the economics behind it, it's probably worth more than its weight in gold. And that's probably when things start getting dicey. So yes, use and misuse is also a kind of a variable term, and you'll have to start putting some guardrails around how we define as goodness. Goodness, fair, very subjective terms, but uh, goodness to one person and intent for a profit making organization that is a shareholder in a listed company is not probably going to be good in the view of the other person. It could be the common man, the general public, or it could be certain other law enforcing activity. So that's where I think the lens that we hold has to be more uniform. And I think I really like your point on bringing in together all the sectoral regulatory authorities, so that there is no bias as we go sector to sector, but talking the same topic. And I think that's another area that's very useful. I also see a question that was asked in the chat on who owns the data, whether it's the patient or the health system that is there. And I'll probably venture an answer into that too. And Arun and Dr. Bharat, correct me if I'm wrong. So the data is owned by the patient, but every processing entity, which is the hospital or any other healthcare providing entity, the insurance, all of them become fiduciaries in it. So they need to handle that data more responsibly. So, question to both Dr. Bharat and Arun in this case. What are your views when we talk about it, when we use the word handle data responsibly? And again, I'm trying to weave in the topic of our conversation, sharing, privacy, and considerations. You know, I'm going to leave out that word security considerations, but then I'm going to say sharing, privacy, and considerations. And that reads a different story as I would like to see it. When we look at the data that is there from a patient's perspective, from saying what is it that we should be looking at when we do all of this? Bharat and Arun, if both of you can take that.
I'll kick off. I'll make a controversial statement. I feel that the concept of ownership has no meaning when it comes to data. I think, like so many things, data or what we seek to do with data is a bundle of things. I'll use a example again to provoke thought. Let's assume tomorrow that I'm going to a hospital and I'm getting treated, and that the details of my treatment are my data. That's a very instinctive thing, right? It's my data. It's about my health. It pertains to me. Now, when I submit that exact same data to my insurance provider, saying that under your insurance contract, you now have to hold me harmless, that insurance provider also has to process that data. And he doesn't process it for the same basis that for the same purposes that I do. I need this data just to show what treatment I have. And, if I've got a implant on my left hip, I need to show that my implant is on my left hip. And as far as the insurance provider is concerned, they're looking at it to make sure that actually surgery is occurred. This is what has been implanted. This is the coverage. This is the protection. This is the policy. Now, instead of me being a good actor today, and so to some extent, we can say, look, there is alignment between both people. It has to be processed in Arun's benefit. Insurer has to process it to make sure Arun gets coverage or not get coverage based on the fair contract that is there between the people. Now, let's swap me out for a bad actor, somebody who doesn't actually have a problem, has merely gone to a hospital and acting in cahoots with that hospital has got a fake invoice of some sort. Does that data still belong to me? The fact that I have gone and gotten admitted for A, I have actually got treatment B, I've come back in with some cosmetic procedure, but I'm now trying to recover money for a hip replacement. Does that data still belong to me? Or does it stop belonging to me because I'm a bad person? Right? And if we are saying it belongs to me, can I reach out and tell the insurance processor tomorrow that you cannot process this data anymore? I have a right to be forgotten. Please take it down immediately. And henceforth, you cannot either deny me coverage or change my premium because it is my data, it is my health data, and that I didn't have a disease at that point in time. So I think ownership is a tricky process. I really feel that we must look at data in the context of to whom is a duty of care owed. And that is the fundamental framework of the Personal Data Protection Bill in India. It is the concept of a fiduciary relationship between the data principal and the data processing entity or the entity which actually deals with the data, which is then the data fiduciary. How this is going to overlap, how they're going to work with each other, how this balance is going to be found to some extent remains to be seen. But I feel that ownership based conversation only works for certain limited instances of processing. For non-consent based processing, which is very well recognized under reasonable purposes under the draft of the bill, which ranges from things like fraud prevention, risk mitigation, search engines, epidemic disease prevention, etc., etc. And COVID is another classic example. We ran into this with Arogya Setu. Easier to do when everybody's life is at risk, but much more difficult to do, for instance, when you're deciding insurance premiums for 65-year-olds living in Chennai. So these balances are tricky to find, and therefore ownership is a limited concept. But I'll hand over to Dr. Bharat for his perspective.
Yeah, so Arun, I agree on that particular point, and I think the PDPB is also based on the same concept of ownership as to the context really matters as to in what context is the processing happening, who is doing the processing, and clearly if there is a layer of addition to the existing data. So I'm also of the view that it depends entirely on the context and the processor who is processing that data. Because it in the example that was also discussed is like I provide my data to a hospital, and there is an addition onto that data by the hospital for an insurance claim, right? So in those cases, the data has been enriched by the hospital when they were processing that data for the particular insurance claim. So that does not really mean that I own that particular data. So that in that scenario, the context would be really of essence, and hence the ownership of the data is really dependent on what processing activities are carried out and by what processor this activity is being carried out. So these two concepts are really important, and I think the PDPB fairly revolves around this particular concept of ownership. So I agree on that particular point, Arun.
And so I just want to, at the risk of using a bad word, one legislation that tried to take this on head on was Disha. Disha had a very interesting approach to this, and I think everybody in the healthcare industry, sort of who engaged on that legislation, realized some of the network effects that something like this could have had. And healthcare is one of those places, as the doctors whom you work with know, where too much or too little risk can have equally lethal consequences. And that is equally true of healthcare data. In one of the biggest problems which we are facing today is this whole concept of localization, and the committee has done a very I'll stop at saying interesting thing in terms of how data can be shared. between repositories in different countries, between collectors and processors, etc. And this, to my mind, seriously circumscribes the ability to create international data lakes, out of which have come things like the COVID vaccine. The ability to create large transnational data repositories has led to the ability to accelerate research and to create medical AIs which can do things faster than human beings can. Unfortunately, of course, taking a risk-centric approach, preventing the formation of those, can have as many adverse healthcare consequences in terms of opportunity cost than stopping them. So I think it's a tricky balance, and Disha, I think, fell on one side of that balance. Like Dr. Saraf said, I think the concept of how the PDP build has dealt with it is very interesting. One sincerely hopes that the Data Protection Authority doesn't undo some of that good work by having a very strong bright line test.
Kumar, I'm going to come next to you because Arun provoked. And he literally said, "What are you talking of? There's nothing called ownership of data. You can do stuff with it, and there's a lot of good that you can do because things like by making this data lake, you got great ideas that made the COVID vaccine, but at the same time, you can start doing absolutely bad things."
Okay.
So, Kumar, two questions for you. The first one is, I think NDHM has recently put out this consultation paper on the storage of the data and what's going to be the length of thing. So, question to you in terms of what are your thoughts? I'm not talking of what is the right thing to do, but I'm talking of from your health systems perspective. How do you see storage and how do you see the burden of that storage? I'm now using the word burden, and you can question me for it. Like, come on, man, all this data is the longitudinal health record, and how dare you call it burden? But then you are a CIO, so you're dealing with the IT behind it. So how are you dealing with that? That's my first question, and then I'll move on to another one after that.
No, I think from a burden, we just have to live with it. I would put it that way because all the data that is actually there, if you are going to, store it and process it and make a good use of it, invariably I don't think medical data can really be purged. We cannot say that this data is required, this data is not required. Or maybe the regulator might come say that these are the fields. It is very difficult to say which data needs to be purged and which data cannot be purged. How long to store it, because you might deal with medical legal cases at a later stage. So data invariably from a provider standpoint, we will have to store it. Maybe infinitely because we need to have that record and that data that is actually there of the patient might be of use or might add richness to a trans border or an international data lake or basically contribute to the country's data lake, which will actually help us in quickly identifying a pandemic or an epidemic or whatever we call it, right? So that burden is definitely there from a data storage standpoint. It is just that we have to be amply prepared to deal with large volumes of data, both structured and unstructured. I'm not so worried about the structured data, but the unstructured data in terms of the images that we need to retain, from various devices. See, today we might have, we might store only CT, MRI, X-ray, and ultrasound. But then look at every device that would actually capture an image, and it means that we will have to store those images for an X amount of time, which means that the overall cost of storing it, putting the controls to protect the security and privacy of that data becomes much higher, and we don't have a way to transfer all these costs to the patient, but we will have to see how best to balance that. So providers will face not challenge now. There are certain providers like ours, who already are dealing with a ton of data, but down the line, it will create a huge burden of us in terms of running costs to maintain this. And we will have certain situations whether to purge or not to purge. But I don't think that we can purge medical data because we don't know what will be the consequences at a later point in time.
Absolutely. During the last couple of months, we've had so many references to the Spanish flu, and had we had more data that there, we could have learnt more, looked at the spread from making it an epidemic, at what stage can it be an endemic, and all of that. And rightly, as you said, there will be a burden, and for the nature and purpose of what healthcare data can do, you can analyze so much out of it, and purging that doesn't really make sense. So question now to Bharat. Volumes, obviously financial sector has got volumes, huge volumes. uh, what is it that we can learn from the financial sector on how to manage the data of healthcare? I really, I don't know how much of unstructured data financial sector has got. Maybe more data is structured, but what is it that we can learn? Because with the financial sector and the data, you've done so many predictions on economic models transcending across time, seasons, and all of those. What do you see would be learnings for healthcare as we deal with these large chunks of both structured and unstructured data?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for sure, financial services deals with a lot of data belonging to consumers. To answer your question, whether structured or unstructured, it's a combination of both, because there is a lot of value add that happens once we get structured data or we get unstructured data, and we run analytics on it, or we utilize that data for different sort of services that are provided in the financial sector. But to your question as to how do we handle this data, and what should be the regime around which this data should be utilized, shared with third parties as well. So I think what is very important to distinguish here is between the financial and the health sector. I think financial sector since many years has been heavily regulated. So there have been sectoral regulations, there have been horizontal regulations that are applicable to the financial services sector, with the RBI leading that charge. And because of these particular regulations, even if there is loads of data that is being handled by the financial services, because of the controls that are put in place, whether that be privacy controls, whether that be security controls, what I understand and get to believe is the regulatory regime of the financial institutions is pretty robust, with all the number of audits that the financial institutions undergo with respect to especially data, handling of data, whether that data is localized. So all these particular elements are key when there is this enormous amount of data that gets handled by industries such as the financial services. So from a learnings perspective, and that is what I was also thinking, especially from a learnings perspective, what is that can translate to the health sector? So clearly, I think regulatory compliance, robust controls on how data is being processed. By processed, I mean collected, stored, shared, transferred, retained, and purged. So the entire data life cycle needs to have stronger controls around data, its utilization. And I think clearly, if you look at the benefits that the financial services has drawn because of the robust regulatory regime that they currently adhere to, I think they are enormous, and that would be a key learning, I would say, that the health sector can draw from the financial services industries.
Bharat, you brought in a great point in terms of financial sector has been well regulated. So Arun, coming to you on this now, in terms of financial sector is well regulated, but the speed to which the healthcare sector is now expecting and is expected to be regulated for the right reasons, regulated for the greater good of finding solutions, regulated to ensure that costs of healthcare don't skyrocket. It's still kept in terms of the need for the delivery of healthcare across the planet, and a planet where healthcare services and the delivery of healthcare services severely challenged with or without the pandemic. The pandemic just brought this whole issue to light, not that the issue was not there before. So, what would be your advice on how can we get it right? And following that to both Kumar and Bharat, uh, what do you see should be the call to action on that?
So while I agree that the financial sector is regulated, I don't know if it's well regulated. The reason I say this is the localization norms. Again, we've seen, for instance, if you have an ecosystem which is 3 people or 4 people, and 3 out of those 4 people are sort of kicked out of the room because they're not willing to do something. There's a question as to, while it may be necessary, I'm not going to the necessity of it. There is a question as to the manner in which something was done, or the perhaps whether more consensus or at least more capacity building could have been done before the button was pushed. And I think, and I say this not just to be contrary, but to indicate that this is a sign of what should not be done here. Unlike the RBI, which follows a licensing regime to operate in the financial sector, you need a license of some sort. And when there is no license in place, you have to rely on a licensed entity, whether you're a fintech or whatever else. You have to lean on a license at least. You have to brush past it to do what you do in that sector if you touch money. That's not the case in healthcare. With while the individual people who are providing healthcare are registered and regulated and have a regulatory body, and perhaps clinical establishments have a body, I think we're all very clear that a lot of healthcare today is preventative, diagnostic. It is healthcare which is being provided outside the context of a conventional healthcare environment. Now, one can always, and of course, the means of providing healthcare have also changed. If you're talking about a situation, for instance, where you have to, not every piece of healthcare is based on a drug or a pharmaceutical or a clinical intervention. A lot of times, a simple change in dietary patterns, a change in timing of food, a change in calorie consumption and load can affect a lot of things. So to summarize, I feel that it's going to be much more tricky to have a homogeneous regulator in this sector, and therefore the two things, while I don't know how this will be done, the two things that should definitely not be done are a abrupt random changes, because this is a sector that can tell you to take a walk fundamentally, and second, an unreasonable burden which will make healthcare more difficult to access, because the consequence here is human lives. It's not somebody taking 10 minutes longer to get some financial remittance. It is somebody being dead when they could have been alive because the cost could not have been paid. I'll hand over back to you, sir.
Absolutely. Speed to diagnosis, doing it right because you're dealing with a life. Running short of time, quick question to Bharat, quick response. What would be your advice on how we can do it right?
I think fair point from Arun as well, considering the severity of health services and the sector. So I do understand that in the financial services, controls play a very key role. But having effective controls is how I would put it, should be the call for action. Because I do understand that, yes, there is on the one side health data, and there is an emergency situation on certain aspects where you need to have that efficiency in place. Plus, on the on the other side, we also have to look at the fact that there is a lot of sensitive data of an individual that is getting processed. So if you have to balance both of these particular aspects, I think we should have effective controls in place so that it's a win-win situation for both the parties.
Kumar, you have the last word. If it were all in your power, how would you think we need to do this right?
No, I think first I would discuss with my senior leadership, or I would say, from an organization standpoint, discuss with the senior leadership, explain the impact of not doing this, right? Explain the risk. That is more important. Help them understand that this is not an IT initiative, okay, and it is an organization initiative. There is going to be change in there's going to be a change in the organization culture. Behavior will change, a lot of things. So the change management aspect of it needs to be looked into. Execute an impact assessment to understand where you are and where you need to go. So that is very important to current state to desired state. Very, very 101, IT 101. Reach out to your existing partners to undertake a security and privacy assessment of their own product to tell them where they are today in their journey. Very important, because you are dealing with an ecosystem of products. Build specific business cases for each of these initiatives, so that, and have specific KPIs. Remember, what you cannot measure, you can never manage. Most importantly, this is a journey and not a one-off exercise. Don't think that if we can just pump in money and this initiative will get auto done. It will never get auto done. It will probably overwhelm us, and this will basically wipe us out like a tsunami. So this is journey and not a one-off exercise. I think we have to remember that, and with a lot of confidence and with a lot of hope, we should step into this train and not say that we will not do it, or we don't want to comply with it.
Kumar, my takeaway words are hope and with a lot of confidence in it. National Digital Health Mission is definitely bringing in a lot of hope. We need to regulate a lot. I know a lot of this can be deliberated. There are lots of ifs and buts, other ways of looking at it, but we need to start somewhere. We need to be looking at data sharing. We need to look at privacy and security considerations, and keep in mind that in healthcare and the whole gamut of data sharing, privacy, security in the context of healthcare is an act of responsibility. We have to do it because we are dealing with healthcare. At the same time, we cannot sidestep issues around economics, issues around profitability, issues around certain aspects of decision making that can benefit a set of people and not there. That balance has to be there, because we're dealing with a pretty large set of what can impact. Always the thought is to impact in Uh, Arun, Dr. Bharat, Kumar, thank you very much for joining us today. Absolute pleasure interacting with all of you. Grateful for you to you for the time you spent with all of us. Thank you very much. Thank you, DSCI, for having all of us here. Over to you, back to the main stage.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.